Audrey Carter took a sip of her water and checked her phone for the 10th time. 7:15 p.m. The plumber was officially 15 minutes late. Her best friend, Chloe, who had orchestrated this entire social experiment, swore he was one of a kind. "He's solid, Audrey. A genuinely hands-on guy who works with his hands. Enough with a nice, average, and very unpunctual plumber," Audrey muttered to herself, already composing the acidic text she would send Chloe later. She was about to signal the waiter and call it a night when a man slid into the seat across from her, slightly out of breath. "Audrey, I am so sorry. I'm Liam. Traffic was a killer." Audrey looked up, ready to deliver a polite yet firm lecture on the relevance of time management, but the words faded in her throat. This was not what she expected. Chloe's somewhat rough description, "Picture a handsome lumberjack," had been an understatement. The man across from her was handsome, yes, but not rustic. He was wearing a simple Henley shirt and jeans that looked suspiciously new, as if they had been purchased an hour earlier specifically for this role. And his hair was immaculately styled, effortlessly. "Liam," she said, catching her breath. She maintained her composure and forced a tight little smile. "The plumber. That's me," he said, extending his hand across the table. She shook his, and that was the first clue. His hand was soft. Extraordinarily soft. There were no calluses, no traces of grease under his nails, no hint that this hand had ever wrestled with a rusty pipe. It was the hand of a man whose heaviest work involved a Mont Blanc pen. So Audrey began, reclining in her chair and giving him a slow, appraising look. "You're a plumber. That must be intense work. Lots of pipes." "Pipes? Yes, lots of pipes," he confirmed, picking up the menu with slightly over-the-top enthusiasm. "Lots of radical ones." Audrey bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. "Interesting, huh? And what kind of plumbing do you specialize in? Residential, commercial, complex piping circumstances?" "Exactly," he said, pulling down the clasp over his watch. It wasn't flashy. It didn't scream, "Look at me." But Audrey, a designer with an eye for detail, recognized quality when she saw it. The craftsmanship was impeccable. The subtle sheen of the metal, the precision of the hands. It wasn't a watch a man who unclogged toilets would wear. "That's a beautiful watch," she interrupted the conversation casually. He pulled his sleeve down instinctively. "Oh, this is an old one. A gift from a grateful client, I presume?" she asked, with a smile that was a bit too sweet. "For fixing a particularly complicated pipe situation." "Circumstance," he chuckled. But it was a nervous sound. Something like that. "Yes." That's when Audrey made a decision. She wasn't going to call him out. Not yet. This was far too fascinating. For the first time in a year of disastrous blind dates, she was genuinely enjoying herself. The game was afoot, and she was suddenly very curious to see how it would play out. Liam, for his part, felt a sense of relief he hadn't felt in years. This woman, Audrey, was amazing. She was sharp, she was insightful. And she hadn't asked him what he did for a living in that tone. The one that was actually asking, "How much do you earn?" She provoked him. She challenged him, but she was looking at him, not at a pedestrian bank balance. He was so accustomed to women's eyes lighting up with dollar signs the moment they discovered his last name. But Audrey's eyes sparkled with genuine amusement. He was falling hard. He had started this whole magnate-in-disguise experiment as a disbelieving defense tactic, a way to filter out the gold diggers. He'd already had 5 bad dates, pretending to be a carpenter, a librarian, and even an aspiring street magician. He had been scorned, ridiculed, and had a drink thrown in his face. But Audrey was different. She was authentic, and he found himself desperately wanting this to work out. "So," he said, as the waiter brought the check, "despite my questionable knowledge of plumbing, would you be willing to see me again?" Audrey pretended to think for a moment, tapping her chin. "I don't know, Liam. My pipes, they've been making a weird gurgling sound lately. Maybe I need a second opinion." He smiled. a genuine, spontaneous smile that made her stomach flip. "I'd be happy to take a look. My diagnostic skills are top-notch." "I'll bet they are," she said, with a smile that matched his. "All right, plumber. You've got a second date." As they left the restaurant, he insisted on walking her to the subway. At the station entrance, they stopped beneath the streetlights. "I had a really good time tonight, Audrey," he said, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice. "Me too, Liam," she replied, and she meant it. "It was enlightening," he laughed. "Good night, Audrey." "Good night, plumber." She watched him walk away, a confident stride that was completely at odds with his flimsy cover story. She pulled out her phone and sent a message to Chloe. "The plumber was a disaster. His hands are softer than a baby's. He thinks tubular is a plumbing term, and he wears a watch that's probably worth more than my apartment, but he's funny and engaging, and I think I'm going to see him again." Chloe's response was instant. "Wait, what? An expensive watch? Maybe he's a high-end plumber for celebrities?" Audrey laughed as she typed back. "Chloe. Or maybe he's something else entirely." She put her phone away, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. "Liam the Vance plumber," she whispered to the deserted street. "Let's see how deep this rabbit hole really goes." The game was afoot, and Audrey Carter fully intended to win. The next morning, Liam Vance was in his penthouse apartment, which was less an apartment, and more a glass and limestone domain floating 50 stories above the city. He sipped an absurdly expensive espresso and stared at a financial report detailing a hostile takeover he was planning. But his mind wasn't on the multi-billion-dollar endeavor. It was on Audrey. "A plumber?" he muttered to himself. A slow smile spread across his face. "She thinks I'm a plumber." Felix, a man who looked like he was born wearing an immaculately pressed suit, appeared at his side holding a tablet. "The preliminary numbers on the German acquisition are in. We project a 17% increase in market share if the transaction closes this week." "Cancel my 2 p.m., Liam said, still looking out the window. A thoughtful expression crossed his face. Felix blinked, his schedule presenting a momentary lapse. "Cancel the meeting with the Sterling Bank Board, sir? But that's a $100 million line of credit. I have a complicated plumbing issue to resolve," Liam replied with utter seriousness. "Reschedule it." Felix merely stared, his mind unsuccessfully trying to process this new variable. Plumbing. His boss, a man who once fired a junior executive for using the wrong font in a presentation, had a 9-figure deal canceled for plumbing. "Very well, sir." He finally relented, making a note on his tablet that likely read, "Investigate local plumbing emergencies and/or schedule a psychological evaluation for Mr. Vance." Mr. Vance's phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number, but he knew exactly who it was. "Hey, plumber, it's Audrey. My sink is making a gurgling sound. It sounds serious. Maybe I need a second opinion sooner than I thought. Are you free this afternoon to help a damsel in distress with her plumbing?" He smiled, typing back immediately. "Your trusted plumber is at your disposal. Send me the address. I'll bring my tools." He had no tools. He didn't even know what tools a plumber used, but he was more excited than he had ever been about any venture in years. 2 hours later, Liam was standing in front of a hardware store in Queens, wearing another brand-new outfit, carefully selected as the attire of an average guy. He had spent 45 full minutes on Google watching Plumbing for Dummies videos, and now felt vaguely confident he could at least identify a pipe wrench. "Ready for this?" Audrey asked, appearing beside him with a mischievous glint in her eye. She was wearing overalls with a paint smudge on the knee, and he thought she had never looked so beautiful. "I was born ready," he lied, trying to look like he belonged in a place that smelled of sawdust and fertilizer. "Great," she said, grabbing a shopping cart, "because I need to replace the entire P-trap system under my sink and maybe install a new shelf in the living room." "You're good with shelves, right?" "Shelves are just horizontal pipes," he said. A statement so absurd that Audrey had to turn away for a second to hide her laughter. They entered the vast and overwhelming world of the hardware store. Audrey, who had spent years restoring antique furniture, navigated the aisles with the confidence of a general. Liam followed her, trying to look knowledgeable and nodding seriously at things he did not understand. "All right, let's start with the essentials," she said, stopping at the plumbing aisle. "I need a good pipe wrench." She pointed to a wall covered with an intimidating collection of metal tools. "Which one do you recommend?" Liam stared at the wall of wrenches. There were big ones, small ones, ones with strange claws, and others that looked like medieval torture instruments. His mind went blank. O vídeo do YouTube havia mostrado uma imagem por 2 segundos, mas agora todas pareciam iguais. "Bem", ele começou, ganhando tempo enquanto apontava vagamente para uma grande e ameaçadora. "Ela ali? Aquela coisa grande de agarrar e torcer? É muito robusta." Audrey a pegou, testando seu peso. "A coisa retorcida de agarrar", ela repetiu, com a voz perfeitamente inexpressiva. "Esse é o termo técnico? Entre nós, profissionais?" "Sim", ele confirmou, rezando para que ela não fizesse mais perguntas. Ela não fez. Apenas deu aquele sorrisinho secreto dela e colocou a chave inglesa no carrinho. "Bom saber. Agora para o sifão. Eu estava pensando em comprar um sifão em P padrão, mas vi que existem esses novos modelos flexíveis. Qual a sua opinião? Melhor fluxo?" A mente de Liam era um turbilhão frenético de diagramas meio lembrados. Fluxo. Ele tinha mencionado algo sobre fluxo no primeiro encontro deles. "Absolutamente", disse ele com uma confiança injustificada. "A fluidez é crucial. Você quer máxima fluidez. Os flexíveis são definitivamente mais fluidos." Ela repetiu, assentindo seriamente enquanto colocava um tubo flexível no carrinho. Faz sentido. Ela estava brincando com ele e ele sabia disso. E a parte mais irritante era que ele estava adorando cada segundo. Ele estava tão absorto no jogo que quase se entregou no corredor ao lado. Enquanto Audrey olhava diferentes tipos de parafusos para madeira, os olhos de Liam foram atraídos por uma vitrine de furadeiras elétricas de alta qualidade. Ele caminhou até lá e pegou uma instintivamente. "Uau, olha só! O torque desta nova matita é impressionante", disse ele, admirando a ferramenta. "O motor sem escovas é um divisor de águas para a eficiência da bateria e a empunhadura ergonômica é perfeitamente equilibrada." Ele parou, percebendo o que acabara de dizer. Olhou para cima e viu Audrey olhando fixamente para ele, com uma sobrancelha arqueada. "Motores sem escova, punhos ergonômicos?" ela perguntou, com a voz carregada de diversão. Esse é um conhecimento bem avançado para um cara que chama uma chave inglesa de coisa de agarrar. Ele rapidamente soltou a furadeira com o rosto corado. Eu assisto muitos programas de reforma de casas." Ele gaguejou. "Sabe, para aprimoramento profissional?" "Claro", ela disse sorrindo largamente. Aprimoramento profissional. Eles terminaram as compras com Liam por pouco não caindo em várias outras armadilhas verbais envolvendo diferentes granulações de lixa e a solidez estrutural das buchas de drywall. Quando chegaram ao caixa, ele sentia como se tivesse acabado de sobreviver a um depoimento de 3 horas. Enquanto caminhavam até o apartamento de Audrey carregando as sacolas de suprimentos, Audrey estava de excelente humor. "Sabe, para um profissional, você se mostra surpreendentemente aberto a novas ideias", disse ela. "A maioria dos encanadores é muito inflexível em relação ao PVC versus cobre. Sou um encanador moderno", disse ele, orgulhoso de sua rapidez de pensamento. "Eu abraço a inovação." Seu apartamento ficava no 3º andar de um charmoso prédio de tijolos aparentes. No momento em que ele entrou, ficou cativado. Era um reflexo dela. Acolhedor, criativo e cheio de personalidade. As paredes estavam cobertas por uma mistura de gravuras e seus próprios esboços. Os móveis eram uma coleção de peças vintage restauradas, cada uma claramente trazida de volta à vida por suas próprias mãos. "Este é o seu lugar?" ele perguntou, olhando em volta com admiração genuína. "É incrível!" "Obrigada!" disse ela, largando as sacolas no chão. A maior parte era lixo antes de eu colocar as mãos nisso. Você tem um talento natural, Audrey, disse ele, passando a mão sobre uma mesa de centro de madeira lindamente restaurada. A maneira como você enxerga o potencial nas coisas é um dom raro. Ela olhou para ele, surpresa com a sinceridade em sua voz. Por um instante, o jogo desapareceu. Não havia encanador, nem magnata, apenas duas pessoas paradas ali, em uma sala de estar banhada de sol, compartilhando um momento de verdadeira conexão. Certo, encanador, disse ela, quebrando o encanto enquanto batia palmas. Hora de trabalhar. Essa pia não vai se consertar sozinha. O que se seguiu foi uma comédia de erros. Liam, sob a supervisão lúdica e ditatorial de Audrey, tentou resolver o problema do encanamento debaixo da pia da cozinha dela. Ele conseguiu pôr mais água no chão do que no balde, ele deixou cair aquela coisa pegajosa e giratória no pé dele e, em certo momento, ficou com a cabeça presa entre dois canos. Tem certeza de que já fez isso antes? Audrey perguntou, rindo tanto que precisou se apoiar no balcão enquanto o observava se esforçar. É uma configuração de tubulação muito peculiar, muito incomum. Ele grunhiu, tentando soltar a cabeça. She finally took pity on him, read the instructions, and guided him through the entire process. An hour later, the new P-trap was installed. It leaked a little, but no major issues. See, he said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of dirt on his forehead. Teamwork, huh? You provided moral support, she said, placing a bucket under the small drip. Next came the shelf. Liam thought this would be easier. It was just a piece of wood and 2 brackets. He was wrong. He managed to hang the shelf completely crooked, drilled a hole in the wrong spot, and almost dropped the whole thing onto her precious ceramic bird collection. Okay, I surrender, he said, laughing as he dropped the drill. I am officially the world's worst handyman. You're not the worst, she said, taking the drill from him with a smile. But you're definitely in the bottom 5. She fixed the shelf in under 10 minutes, her movements quick and efficient. He just stood watching, completely fascinated. They ended up sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by tools and sawdust, sharing a pizza she had ordered. So, she said, taking a bite, I'm guessing plumbing isn't your primary occupation. His heart stopped. Had she figured everything out? What makes you think that? He asked, trying to sound casual. Let's see, she said, counting on her fingers. Your hands are smoother than a CEO's. You know more about brushless motors than pipe connections, and you can hang a shelf with the structural integrity of a wet napkin. She took another bite of pizza. But at least you managed not to get sauce on your shirt, so that's progress. He laughed, a sound of pure relief. She was still playing. I'm a man of many hidden talents, he said. Hidden is the key word, she countered, with a mischievous glint in her eyes. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. The sunset cast long shadows across the room. No, Audrey, he said, his voice lower now. Today was fun. More fun than I've had in a long time. Even with your near-death experience under my sink. Especially with that, he said, and he meant it. He looked around the apartment once more, at the world she had built with her own 2 hands, at the woman sitting across from him, who was so brazenly herself. I know I'm not who you think I am, he began, the lie suddenly feeling heavy and wrong. She stopped eating and looked at him, her expression unreadable. And who do you think you are, Liam? He didn't know how to answer. He was a liar, a magnate playing a part. But in that moment, sitting on her floor, covered in sawdust, he had never felt so much like himself. I guess, he said slowly, looking her directly in the eye. I'm just a man who's incredibly lucky to have met you. Audrey held his gaze for a long moment, and he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't suspicion, nor amusement, but something warmer, something that made his heart beat a little faster. Well, Plumber, she said, in a small voice and a genuine smile that lit up her lips. For a liar, you're surprisingly honest. The day after the hardware store adventure, Audrey's small apartment was in a state of organized chaos. Tools were scattered across the floor. The new shelf stood proudly and perfectly installed on the wall, and the kitchen sink was miraculously no longer leaking. Her cell phone vibrated with a message from Liam. "We survived the night. No mysterious floods or collapsing shelves. I'd say that's a win. I hope your patient, the sink, is recovering well." Audrey smiled and typed back, "The patient is stable. No thanks to the surgeon, but the moral support was excellent. I've decided to forgive your complete absence of manual skills." His response was instantaneous. "To celebrate my forgiveness, how about a less hands-on date? There's a new photography exhibit at the Met. I hear it's very picturesque." Audrey laughed. A plumber who suggests the Met. This man was a walking contradiction, and she found him utterly irresistible. "The Met? Are you sure you won't drop sawdust on the Picassos? I'll wear my dressiest jeans, no sawdust. Saturday at 2 p.m., I'll meet you there." Audrey confirmed, a playful smile on her face. A date at the Met with a man who was pretending to be a plumber. The game was getting more interesting by the minute. On Saturday, Audrey arrived at the museum. To her surprise, Liam was already waiting at the entrance. He wore dark jeans and a simple, well-fitting gray sweater. He was incredibly attractive. And, once again, nothing like a plumber. "You're very dressed up, plumber," she teased as she approached. "I left my grab-and-twist device at home," he replied with a smile, effortlessly resuming the shared joke. "I thought it might not be appropriate for the museum." They entered the exhibition, a vast, silent space filled with striking black-and-white photographs of urban landscapes. Audrey, who is also a visual artist, immediately felt at ease, pointing out details in the composition and lighting. Liam walked beside her, listening attentively, but Audrey noticed something odd. He wasn't just agreeing with her, he was adding his own, surprisingly insightful comments. "Look at the use of negative space here," Audrey said, pointing to a powerful photo of a solitary figure on a bridge. "It creates such a strong sense of isolation. It's very Hopper-esque." Liam commented almost to himself. "The geometry of the architecture encloses the subject. It's not just isolation, it's a chosen solitude." Audrey stopped and turned to him, one eyebrow arched. "Hopper-esque? That's a pretty erudite term for a plumber." He froze for a second, a flicker of panic in his eyes before he quickly recovered. "I watch a lot of documentaries on PBS, he said a little too quickly. "Oh, about art and pipes? Sometimes they overlap." "Art and pipes," she repeated, her face perfectly serious. "Of course, the great masters of Renaissance plumbing." He laughed, a nervous but genuine sound. "Exactly, Michelangelo." She let it go but stored the information. "PBS documentaries?" "Right." They continued through the gallery, the cat-and-mouse game in full swing. He would drop a sophisticated observation about photographic techniques, followed by a quick attempt to relate it to plumbing in the most absurd way possible. "The graininess in this photo gives it such a raw texture, such a palpable quality," he would say, and then add, "almost like the feel of high-grade copper before you solder the pipe." Audrey just nodded wisely, as if this were the most obvious thing in the world. In front of a large, moving photograph of a deserted city street at dawn, the mood changed. The photo was beautiful, but painfully lonely. Audrey was about to make a comment about the composition when she realized Liam had fallen completely silent. He stared at the image, but his gaze was distant, his charming smile gone, replaced by an expression of deep sadness. "Liam?" she asked softly. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "No," he said in a low, murmured voice. "Just reflecting." He took a deep breath. "Have you ever felt like people don't actually see you? I mean, the real you?" The question was so unexpected, so raw, that Audrey was caught completely off guard. The playful plumber was gone. In his place was a man revealing a genuine crack in his armor. "Sometimes," she replied honestly. He finally turned to look at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes was stunning. "I grew up in a family where the family business was everything," he said, choosing his words carefully. "It's a big, successful operation, and from the start, when I was a kid, that was all people saw. Not me, Liam, but the business heir, the future of the company. Audrey listened, her heart suddenly aching for him. He was still lying about the details, but she knew with an almost physical certainty that the emotions were real. In every conversation, in every relationship, it was always there, he continued, his voice low and laden with an bitterness she had never heard before. Do they like me? Or do they like what the business can do for them? Do they want to be my friend? Or do they want a contract? After a while, you just stop being able to tell the difference. He looked away, returning to gaze at the deserted street in the photograph. So, I started this experiment to see if it was possible to find someone who could just see me, a normal guy, no company, no name, no pipes. He gave a small, sad smile. In that instant, Audrey's perspective shifted completely. This wasn't just a game to him. He wasn't a bored magnate doing this for kicks. It was a desperate, clumsy, and deeply human attempt to find something authentic. He wasn't pulling a prank on her. He was trying to protect himself. And did the experiment work? She asked softly. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were so full of a pure, hopeful emotion that it took her breath away. I met you, he said simply, as if that were the only answer that mattered. The intimacy of the moment was so intense that it felt like they were the only two people in the museum. The banter, the witty responses, the whole cat-and-mouse game, it all dissipated, leaving behind something fragile and incredibly real. Liam? She began, not even knowing what she was going to say. Liam Vance, is that you, darling? A loud theatrical voice shattered the moment. A woman nearing 70, draped in clothing that looked like it came from an entire jewelry store and a fur coat despite the mild weather, advanced on them like a luxury cruise ship. Liam's face went from vulnerable to pure panic in a millisecond. Oh no, he muttered softly. He grabbed Audrey's hand. Quick. I just remembered a very important faucet exhibition in the modern sculpture wing. He started to pull her away, but it was too late. Liam, it is you, exclaimed Mrs. Eleanor Voss, blocking his path. I hardly recognized you in those rustic clothes. Are you participating in some charity event? Mrs. Voss, Liam said, forcing a tight, terrified smile. What a surprise. And who is this charming young woman? Mrs. Voss asked, examining Audrey from head to toe with elegant condescension. This is Audrey, Liam said quickly. She's a colleague, a plumbing consultant. Plumbing consultant? Mrs. Voss repeated the words as if they were from a foreign and somewhat obscene language. How fascinating. Well, you two simply must come to my gala on Saturday. Everyone will be there. We'd love to, but we're incredibly busy with a major citywide plumbing crisis, Liam said, pulling Audrey behind him. It was lovely seeing you, Mrs. Voss. He practically sprinted away, dragging a very confused Audrey with him, stumbling through the crowd until they were safely hidden behind a large, abstract metal sculpture that looked like a pile of, well, pipes. All right, Audrey said, catching her breath and trying not to laugh. Who was that? And what was that about a citywide plumbing crisis? That, Liam said, peeking out from behind the sculpture, was the most dangerous gossip columnist in New York City. And the pipe crisis is what we call an emergency exit strategy. She finally let out the laugh she had been holding. You are the most ridiculous man I have ever met. Thank you, he said, smiling, the panic in his eyes replaced by amusement. I try my best. They left the museum. The light, easy energy between them had returned, but now it was imbued with something new, something deeper. They walked through Central Park as the afternoon sun cast a golden light through the trees. So, she said with a gentle tone, it's the family business. That's a heavy burden to carry. You have no idea, he said, the smile fading slightly. Sometimes it feels like I'm just playing a role that was written for me before I was even born. Maybe it's time you wrote your own script, she suggested softly. He stopped walking and turned to her. I think so, he said, with a sincerity in his voice that deeply moved her. That's what I'm trying to do with you. They stood there in the park's tranquility, the city noise, a distant hum. He reached out, not to hold hers in rushed intent, but gently caressed her cheek, his thumb tracing softly along her jawline. "Audrey," he whispered, his eyes seeking hers. She didn't pull away. She didn't make a joke. She just looked at him, at the lonely man behind the magnate, looking at the scared boy behind the captivating plumber. He leaned in, and this time the kiss was different. It wasn't an awkward, sudden shock, nor a moment of panic. It was slow and tender, and filled with all the unspoken things that had just passed between them. It was a kiss that tasted of vulnerability and a fragile, hopeful new beginning. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'm so sorry I'm lying to you," he murmured. "You still haven't told me the whole truth," she whispered back. "I know," he said, "and that terrifies me." She pulled back enough to look him in the eyes. "Oh?" she said, with a small, knowing smile on her lips. "For a man who is afraid, you are surprisingly brave." He laughed, a sound of pure, genuine relief. When they started walking again, their hands naturally found each other. The game wasn't over, but it had changed. It was no longer about who was fooling whom. It was about how long two people can sustain a beautiful, complex lie before the truth changes everything. A week after the museum visit, Liam found himself in what he internally called his plumber's apartment, a small, minimalist, and tasteful but decidedly non-magnate flat he rented in Brooklyn for the sole purpose of maintaining his facade. He stared at a box of spaghetti with the same intensity he usually reserved for hostile takeover documents. "All right," he said to his empty kitchen. "Boil water, add pasta, wait 8 to 10 minutes. How hard can it be?" He was about to find out. He was trying to cook for Audrey for the first time, a gesture he hoped would convey competent boyfriend normalcy, not a man who usually had a personal chef. When Audrey arrived, the kitchen was a battlefield. The smoke alarm emitted a sad, defeated chirp. The water in the pot had boiled over onto the stove, and Liam was holding a colander full of spaghetti that had somehow managed to stay together in a single solid block while being undercooked. Audrey stopped at the kitchen entrance, observed the scene, and burst out laughing. "Wow, plumber, it looks like you tried to fix a leak and it exploded." The instructions were misleading, he said, defending his culinary honor while poking the block of spaghetti with a fork. "Al dente. This is more like concrete." She walked over, still laughing, and gently took the colander from him. "Let me guess. You threw all the pasta in at once without stirring, didn't you? That's not the correct procedure. Only if you're trying to build a pasta sculpture," she said, her eyes twinkling. She looked at the pot on the stove, where a red sauce bubbled menacingly. "And what is that?" "A masterpiece," he said with a touch of pride. "That's my grandmother's secret marinara sauce." Audrey dipped a spoon in, tasted it, and her expression was a perfect mix of sympathy and amusement. "Liam, does Grandma's recipe by any chance include an entire jar of sugar?" He blinked. "Is that too much?" "Only if you don't plan on serving it with ice cream," she said, patting his arm. "Don't worry, I can fix this." Over the next hour, they worked side by side in the small kitchen. Audrey, with the natural grace of someone who really knew how to cook, saved the sauce, taught him to cook pasta correctly, and even managed to make garlic bread that didn't set off the smoke alarm. Liam was relegated to the role of official vegetable chopper, a job he executed with intense, almost surgical concentration. "Oh," he said, meticulously dicing a tomato. "This is surprisingly pleasant." "What? Ruining a perfectly good meal?" "No," he said, looking at her while she stirred the sauce, his face illuminated by the warm kitchen light. "Doing this with you?" She smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made his heart do that silly little jump again. They ate at her small kitchen table. The repurposed spaghetti tasted better than any Michelin-starred meal he had ever had. The conversation flowed easily, moving from her work to his increasingly absurd made-up stories about his plumbing adventures. Audrey, playing her part in the game, had started leaving small tests for him. "You know, Liam, I have this freelance client who's a real nightmare," she began casually, stirring the pasta on her fork. "He's trying to wiggle out of paying me for a big branding project I just finished." "Ah, yes," said Liam, his CEO instincts immediately kicking in, though he tried to disguise it. "What's his excuse?" "He claims the work wasn't what he envisioned, even though he approved every version," she said, a note of real frustration in her voice. "He's a slippery character. He keeps citing obscure clauses in our contract." "Let me see the contract," said Liam, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly from charming plumber to ruthless businessman. "What do you know about contracts?" she teased. But still, she grabbed her laptop, eager to see how he would handle this. She pulled up the email exchange with her client, a man named Mr. Sterling. Liam pulled his chair closer, his arm brushing hers as he leaned in to read the screen. The playful energy between them vanished, replaced by a concentrated intensity. As he read, Audrey watched his expression change. His brow furrowed, his jaw tightened, and his eyes, which were usually warm and amused when he was with her, became sharp and cold like steel. "This guy is an amateur," Liam murmured as he scanned the email. "He's using standard stalling tactics, trying to drown you in vague complaints to force a discount." He pointed to a clause in the contract. "See here? The subjective satisfaction clause. It's an old trick, but it's legally flimsy if you have a documented approval trail." "He approved the final finishes via email last Tuesday," she said, the frustration of her character now mixed with her own genuine fascination. "Perfect," said Liam, his voice now crisp and authoritative. "That's all we need. All right. Here's what you're going to do. Draft an email. Subject, final invoice and documentation for project approval." Audrey started typing as he dictated, her fingers moving quickly to keep up with the pace. "Dear Mr. Sterling," Liam began, his voice calm and lethal. "In accordance with our signed contract, I am resending the final invoice for the completed branding project. For your convenience, I have enclosed the full email thread in which you provided written approval at every stage of development, including the final design on Tuesday, October 24th. Per Section 4B of our contract, final approval constitutes acceptance of the work and initiates the 15-day payment period. We await timely remittance to avoid the late fees stipulated in Section 6C. He paused, took a deep breath, and then delivered the fatal blow. "Should you desire to contest this, I will be happy to forward all documentation to my counsel. Sincerely, Audrey Carter." Audrey's hands froze on the keyboard. She turned slowly to look at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. The charming, clumsy plumber had just dictated an email that was a work of art in corporate warfare. "Legal counsel," she repeated slowly. "That's a little aggressive for a plumber's advice, don't you think?" Liam blinked, snapping out of his CEO trance. He looked at the email on the screen, then at Audrey's stunned face, and realized he had dramatically overplayed his hand. "I watch a lot of legal dramas," he said, desperately searching for an excuse. "You know, Suits, The Good Wife. You pick things up. That up from a TV show?" she asked. One of her eyebrows arched so high it almost touched her hairline. "They're very educational shows," he insisted, though he knew he sounded ridiculous. "Great for learning about legal plumbing." "Legal plumbing," her face completely impassive. "Of course." She didn't push further. She just looked at the email, then at him, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. "Okay, plumber, let's see if your TV law degree works." She hit send. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound being the hum of the refrigerator. Liam was sweating. What if the guy had called his bluff? What if he had just made things worse for her? Then Audrey's laptop chimed. A new notification. An email from Mr. Sterling. She opened it. It was short and not very pleasant. "My sincere apologies, Ms. Carter. There seems to have been a misunderstanding on my part. The invoice will be paid in full by the end of the day. My compliments on your excellent and thorough work." Audrey read the email aloud, her voice laced with triumph. She then turned her chair to face Liam, who was looking at her with a mixture of pride and sheer panic. She leaned forward, her eyes sparkling. "Liam," she said, her voice a low, playful purr. For a guy who fixes toilets, you sure know how to make a corporate shark back down." He laughed, a nervous, shaky laugh. "Like I said, it all comes down to understanding the flow." "Right," she said, her smile unwavering. "The flow?" She leaned in a little closer, and the playful energy between them suddenly became electrifying. "You know, all this talk of contracts and legal issues is surprisingly hot." "It is?" he whispered, his voice suddenly husky. "Absolutely," she murmured. She closed the laptop, effectively eliminating the last barrier between them. She stood up and walked around the small table, stopping right in front of him. "Thank you for helping me, Liam. You're amazing." "Any time," he said, his eyes fixed on her lips. She delicately touched the spot of dirt that was still on his forehead. "No," she whispered, running her fingers along his cheek. "You're a terrible plumber and a pretty convincing liar." She paused, her lips just millimeters from his. "But really, really good partner." And with that, she closed the distance, kissing him with a ferocity and gratitude that took his breath away. The lie was still there, hanging between them, bigger and more obvious than ever. But as he returned the kiss, pulling her onto his lap, Liam realized he didn't care. Because for the first time, he hadn't used his money or his power to solve a problem. He had used his mind, his true self, and she was kissing him for it. But a week after Liam's impromptu legal consultation, Audrey found a thick, cream-colored envelope in her mailbox. Inside were 2 tickets to the Metropolitan Preservation Gala, one of New York City's most exclusive and expensive charity events. A small typed note was attached. "Ms. Carter, in appreciation of your exceptional work and persuasive legal arguments, T. Sterling." Audrey stared at the tickets, a slow, mischievous smile spreading across her face. Mr. Sterling, the client Liam had cleverly terrorized and forced to pay the bill, had just handed her the perfect weapon, or rather, the perfect laboratory for her ongoing experiment. What better place to test a fake plumber than in the heart of the city's high society? She picked up her phone and texted Liam. "Hey, plumber, you won't believe what just happened. My very difficult client was extremely satisfied with my work and persuasive legal argument. He sent me 2 tickets to the Met Gala this Friday as a thank you. Do plumbers go to galas?" His reply was almost instantaneous. "Galas? I don't know. I think they usually don't fit our pipe schedule. But for you, I'll make an exception. What's the dress code?" "Fancy overalls," Audrey laughed. "Liam, tuxedo. And don't worry, I'll teach you which fork to use." It's a date. On Friday night, Liam's assistant, Felix, was in a state of silent panic. He stood in Liam's closet, a closet the size of a small apartment, surrounded by at least 30 tuxedos. "Sir, are you absolutely sure?" Felix asked, holding up an impeccably cut Tom Ford tuxedo. "It's an exquisite piece, but it's also part of the most recent collection." "What if someone recognizes it?" "Felix," Liam said, adjusting the cuffs of a crisp white shirt. "The goal is to look like a plumber trying to dress up, not a magnate. Find me something less perfect." "Perfect, sir," Felix repeated, the concept utterly alien to him. "Yes, something overlooked. Something I wore 2 years ago. And for God's sake, not the politically correct Felipe. Give me the vintage Omega my grandfather left me, the one with the leather strap." "A vintage Omega, sir?" Felix looked horrified. "But that's sentimental." "Exactly," Liam said with a smile. "It's my plumber who inherited a watch from his grandfather." When Liam arrived at Audrey's brownstone, he looked impeccable. He was handsome enough to turn heads, but his look was subtly off. The slightly dated tuxedo and the discreet watch gave him the air of someone who was trying hard, but didn't quite fit in. Perfect. Audrey opened the door, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. She wore a simple, elegant emerald green dress that hugged her curves and made her eyes sparkle. She looked like a goddess. "Wow," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "Look, wow." "You don't look half bad yourself, plumber," she said with a warm smile. "Ready to swim with the sharks." "As long as I'm with you," he replied, and he meant much more than she could imagine. The gala was a stunning, breathtaking spectacle of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, a string quartet played softly in a corner, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and discreet ambition. Audrey, who had never been to such an opulent event, felt a genuine flutter in her stomach. Liam, on the other hand, had to actively suppress his instinct to sweep the room with the casual authority of a king in his own court. "All right," Audrey whispered, threading her arm through his as they entered the main ballroom. "Rule number 1 of high society. Look impressed, but not overly so. Like you've seen it all before, but are still appreciating the view." "Got it," Liam said with a tranquil expression and a grateful jolt when he looked at a sculpture from the DGA that his family's foundation had lent to the museum. "Wow, look at that. That statue. It's very imposing." Audrey squeezed his arm, trying not to laugh. "You've got a natural talent." They mingled with Audrey serving as his guide. She pointed out famous artists and members of the Old Money Society, whispering little stories she had read in magazines. Meanwhile, Liam played the part of the fascinated outsider, asking questions whose answers he already knew and making plumbing-related observations about the museum's architecture. "No," he said, looking at the imposing vaulted ceiling. "The water pressure in a building this old must be a nightmare. I'd love to see the pipe schematic. Let's try to keep the workshop talk to a minimum tonight, okay?" she said, patting his arm. It was near the champagne fountain that their game was almost interrupted. A gray-haired man with a sharp, predatory smile approached them. It was Spencer Hale, Liam's biggest rival in the hotel industry. "Vance," Spencer said, his eyes glinting with malice as he looked Liam up and down. "What a surprise to find you here, and dressed so modestly. Are you between acquisitions?" Liam's smile didn't waver, but Audrey felt his arm tense beneath her hand. "Hale," he said, his voice dangerously smooth. "Always a pleasure." Spencer's gaze shifted to Audrey, and his smile widened. "And you haven't introduced me to your lovely companion yet." Before Liam could invent another lie, Audrey stepped forward, extending her hand with a confidence that surprised even herself. "Audrey Carter," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'm Liam's cultural attaché." The two men blinked. "Cultural attaché," Spencer repeated, intrigued. "Yes," Audrey continued, thinking a mile a minute. "Liam's plumbing business is looking to expand into the luxury hotel market, and he's hired me to help him understand the aesthetic and social nuances of the luxury hospitality world." She vaguely gestured to the opulent room. "This evening is part of his field research." Liam almost choked on his champagne. It was the most brilliant, absurd, and perfect lie he had ever heard. Spencer looked from Audrey to Liam, who was now nodding with intense seriousness. "Looking into luxury hotels," Spencer said slowly, an expression of complete confusion on his face. "How innovative. We believe there's a real gap in the market for artisan, personalized plumbing solutions," Liam added, getting into the spirit of it. "We're talking handcrafted faucets, piping aligned with functional principles. It's the next big thing." Spencer stared at them for a long moment. After a moment of silence, he finally shook his head. "Well, Vance, you've always been unpredictable. A pleasure, Miss Carter." He walked away, clearly convinced he had just talked to two lunatics. As soon as he was out of earshot, Liam pulled Audrey into a secluded nook behind a marble column. He was laughing, a genuine, deep laugh of joy that melted her heart. "Cultural attaché," he said, wiping away a tear. "Bagpipes, you're a genius." "I think fast," she said, her face flushed with the adrenaline of the shared charade. "And you owe me big time." "I owe you my life," he said, his laughter subsiding and his expression turning serious. He looked at her, the playful energy between them transforming into something more intense. "Thank you for that, Audrey." "We're a team, right?" she said, her voice slightly choked. "Yes," he replied, his gaze dropping to her lip. "We are." The string quartet music swelled, and he extended his hand. "May I have this dance, my brilliant cultural attaché?" She smiled and took his hand. "You may, my innovative plumber." He led her onto the dance floor, and as he pulled her into his arms, the rest of the world disappeared. They moved in perfect synchronization, a silent conversation passing between them. The game was still on, but it was no longer about deception. It was about partnership. "I hate lying to you," he murmured into her hair as they swayed to the music. "I know," she whispered back, "but you're getting surprisingly good at it." He pulled back enough to look into her eyes. "Audrey," he said, his voice full of a sincerity that transcended all the lies. "Tonight, being here with you is the first time in years I've actually enjoyed one of these things. Even with the threat of your arch nemesis. Especially with that," he said, "because I wasn't alone." In that moment, under the glittering chandeliers, surrounded by the city's elite, Audrey realized her little experiment had gone wonderfully wrong. She hadn't just caught a magnate in a lie. She had started to fall in love with the man behind it. When they left the gala, they didn't take the car that was waiting for them. Instead, they walked, feeling the cool night air, a welcome relief after the stuffy ballroom. The sound of her heels and his dress shoes echoed on the empty sidewalk. "So," she said, breaking the pleasant silence, taking his hand, "was your field research a success?" It was revealing. "I learned that champagne tastes better when you pretend you can't afford it." She smiled. She leaned her head on his shoulder as they walked. They ended up at a small 24-hour diner, a brightly lit beacon of normalcy after the opulence of the gala. They slid into a booth, the worn vinyl a stark contrast to the velvet chairs they had been sitting in an hour before. They ordered coffee and a slice of apple pie to share. "This is more my speed," she said, taking a sip of the diner coffee. "Mine too," he said, and she knew he wasn't lying. They sat there for a long time, just talking. The masks had fallen. There was no need for games or cover story. He told her about the suffocating pressure of his world, the constant expectation, the loneliness. She told him about her own struggles, the quiet fear of never realizing her dream. "You know, for a man who is pretending to be someone else," she said, her voice soft, "you're the most authentic person I've met in a long time." He stared at her across the table, his eyes full of a raw, unprotected emotion. "That's because I'm only real when I'm with you, Audrey." He reached his hand across the table, covering her. "I'm falling in love with you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And it terrifies me, because everything is built on a lie." She turned her hand over, intertwining her fingers with his. "Maybe," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "The lie is just the story we had to tell to find the truth." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes, and in the quiet of the late-night diner, surrounded by the aroma of coffee and the soft hum of the city, Liam Vance, the magnate, and Audrey Carter, the graphic designer, finally stopped playing their game. He leaned across the table and she met him halfway, sealing their new, fragile truth with a kiss as sweet and as real as the apple pie they had forgotten on the plate between them. The week following Liam's impromptu legal consultation, Audrey found a thick cream-colored envelope in her mailbox. Inside were 2 tickets to the Metropolitan Preservation Gala, one of New York City's most exclusive and expensive charity events. A small typed note was attached. "Ms. Carter, in appreciation of your exceptional work and persuasive legal arguments, T. Sterling." Audrey stared at the tickets, a slow, mischievous smile spreading across her face. Mr. Sterling, the client Liam had cleverly terrorized and forced to pay the bill, had just handed her the perfect weapon, or rather, the perfect laboratory for her ongoing experiment. What better place to test a fake plumber than in the heart of the city's high society? She picked up her phone and texted Liam. "Hey, plumber, you won't believe what just happened. My very difficult client was extremely satisfied with my work and persuasive legal argument. He sent me 2 tickets to the Met Gala this Friday as a thank you. Do plumbers go to galas?" His reply was almost instantaneous. "Galas? I don't know. I think they usually don't fit our pipe schedule, but for you, I'll make an exception. What's the dress code?" "Fancy overalls," Audrey laughed. "Liam, Tuxedo. And don't worry, I'll teach you which fork to use. It's a date. On Friday night, Liam's assistant, Felix, was in a state of silent panic. He stood in Liam's closet, a closet the size of a small apartment, surrounded by at least 30 tuxedos. "Sir, are you absolutely sure?" Felix asked, holding up an impeccably cut Tom Ford tuxedo. "It's an exquisite piece, but it's also part of the most recent collection. What if someone recognizes it?" "Felix," Liam said, adjusting the cuffs of a crisp white shirt. "The goal is to look like a plumber trying to dress up, not a magnet." "Find me something less perfect." "Perfect, sir," Felix repeated, the concept utterly alien to him. "Yes, something overlooked. Something I wore 2 years ago. And for God's sake, not the politically correct Felipe. Give me the vintage Omega my grandfather left me, the one with the leather strap." "A vintage Omega, sir?" Felix looked horrified. "But that's sentimental." "Exactly," Liam said with a smile. "It's my plumber who inherited a watch from his grandfather." When Liam arrived at Audrey's brownstone, he looked impeccable. He was handsome enough to turn heads, but his look was subtly off. The slightly dated tuxedo and the discreet watch gave him the air of someone who was trying hard, but didn't quite fit in. Perfect. Audrey opened the door, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. The week following the gala was dizzying, a wonderful, blurred vision. For the first time in his adult life, Liam Vance was acting like a man in love, not a CEO managing an asset. He would show up at Audrey's apartment with a grocery bag and a hopeful expression, ready for another disastrous but hilarious cooking lesson. He learned that adding sugar to tomato sauce was a cardinal sin, that assembling IKEA furniture was a 2-person job that required at least 1 bottle of wine, and that listening to Audrey talk passionately about the difference between mid-century modern and Art Deco was more fascinating than any stock market report. Audrey, for her part, was leaning into the charm and absurdity of her new relationship. She was dating a man who pretended to be a plumber, and she pretended not to know he was. Lying. Their entire relationship was a running joke, an unspoken thing. But the feelings blossoming within it were surprisingly real. "Okay, plumber," she said one night as they sat on her newly installed shelf, which had become their favorite perch. "I need to ask you a serious question about your profession." "Ask away," he said, looking far too comfortable for a man who had nearly drilled through his own hand early. "When you're fixing a complicated plumbing issue," she began, her eyes sparkling with mischief, "do you ever feel the need to consult international financial advisors first?" He choked on his beer. "That is a very specific question. Is this a trick?" "Just curious," she said, shrugging. "I imagine aligning the pipes with global market trends might be very important for the flow." He burst into laughter, pulling her close. "You're never going to let me forget that, are you?" "Never," she confirmed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Your plumbing lies are my favorite thing about you." He smiled, but a flicker of his old fear shone in his eyes. He hated the lies. He hated the constant fear of being exposed. But he was even more terrified of what would happen when the truth finally came out. What if she looked at him differently? What if the easy, fun dynamic they had built was replaced by the same awkwardness and expectation he saw in everyone else's eyes? He was so lost in his thoughts that he almost missed what she said next. "Oh, by the way," she said, sitting up, "I got an email today. You're not going to believe this." "What?" "You know that design blog, Downtown Living, the super famous one?" "I'm familiar with it," he said, his CEO brain automatically calculating its significance, market reach, and "Well, they want to do a feature on me," she said, with a tone of genuine disbelief in her voice. "About my furniture restoration, my design philosophy. They're calling it the new face of Brooklyn design." For a second, Liam's heart swelled with pride. She deserved this. Her talent was immeasurable, and the world was finally starting to notice. But then a cold wave of panic hit him. An interview, a feature story. That meant questions, personal questions. "Audrey, that's incredible," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know. It's unbelievable, right?" she said, Her face lit up with an emotion that was both beautiful and terrifying to him. "They're sending a journalist and a photographer to my apartment on Friday." Friday. Days. 3 days until a professional journalist whose job it was to dig into people's lives sat in Audrey's living room and asked about her inspirations, her work, and inevitably, her new boy. "That's fast," he managed to say. "Tell me about it," she said, already planning. "I need to clean the house, maybe finish restoring that antique armchair." She stopped talking, noticing the look on his face. The joy on her own face slowly faded, replaced by an expression of sharp concern. "Liam, what is it? You look like you just saw a ghost." He tried to force a smile. "No, it's nothing. I'm just so happy for you." She didn't believe it. She moved closer, her playful demeanor gone, her gaze now serious and perceptive. "No, it's more than that. This interview is making you nervous, isn't it?" He looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "It's your moment, Audrey. I don't want to overshadow it." "Overshadow it," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Or be exposed by it." He finally looked at her, the panic and fear he had been hiding now visible on his face. He didn't need to say anything. She already knew. "It's the boyfriend question, isn't it?" she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. "The part where they ask about the handy plumber I'm dating." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure anxiety and frustration. "Audrey, I am so sorry. I put you in an impossible situation. This is your big break, and my stupid secret is about to ruin it." She watched him, her expression a mix of sympathy and something that looked like actual affection for his past state. She had seen him handle a corporate rival with chilling calm. She had heard him dictate a legal threat that could make a shark sweat, and now he was falling apart over a magazine interview. She gently took his hand. "Hey," she said, her voice a soft balm to his frayed nerves. "Look at me." He did, and he looked like a little boy who was lost. "First of all," she said, adopting a tone of calm authority, "you are not going to ruin. And second, you seem to have forgotten who you're dealing with." She gave him a small, confident smile. "I am a woman who turns trash into treasure. Dealing with a nosy journalist is nothing." "But what are you going to say?" he asked, his voice filled with a vulnerability she had never seen before. "The moment they Google Liam the plumber, they won't find anything. Then they'll start digging. And that is why we won't let them dig," she said, her eyes lighting up with familiar mystery. She stood up and started pacing, her designer brain now fully engaged in a new kind of project. Damage control. "Okay, here's the plan. We'll give them a story, but it will be our story, our way." He just stared at her, utterly mesmerized. She wasn't angry. She wasn't disappointed. She was taking charge. She was protecting him. "The interview will be here in my apartment," she continued, thinking out loud. "This is our territory. I control the environment." She stopped and pointed at him. "You will be here." "I will?" he asked, horrified. "Audrey, that is a terrible idea. What if I say something stupid? What if I mention my family's vast collection of "You will be working here as my handyman," she said, a brilliant, mischievous smile spread across her face. "You will be in the background fixing that dripping faucet I've been meaning to get to. You will wear your most convincing plumber's outfit. You will be seen, but not heard. A charmingly blue-collar backdrop for my artistic genius." He stared at her, a slow grin beginning to form on his own face. The plan was absurd, risky, and utterly insane. It was perfect. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" he said, admiration in his tone. "Immensely," she confirmed. "You lied to me. You deceived me for weeks, Liam Vance. It's only fair that I use your lie for my own creative purpose." She walked back toward him. She sat down beside him, her expression soft. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice sincere now. "Together." He took her hand, his heart filled with a feeling so overwhelming he could barely describe it. It was a mixture of love, gratitude, and a profound sense of relief. He had spent his whole life building walls to protect himself, and here was this incredible woman, not trying to tear them down, but offering to stand guard with him. "All right, boss," he said, squeezing her hand. "What's my first task?" "First," she said, a mischievous glint back in her eyes, "we need to get you a real tool belt. The one you have in your plumber's apartment looks like you bought it at a costume shop." He laughed, a genuine, unburdened laugh, free of fear for the first time in days. "It was from a costume shop," he admitted. "I knew it," she said, shaking her head. "Honestly, plumber, you're lucky to have me." On Friday, Audrey's apartment was a whirlwind of activity. The journalist, an elegant, impeccably dressed woman named Clara, arrived accompanied by a photographer. They immediately began chatting animatedly about Audrey's restored furniture and clever design solutions. "This is excellent, Audrey," Clara said, running a hand over a vintage armchair Audrey had reupholstered. "Your style is so authentic." "Thank you," Audrey said, trying to control her nervousness as she offered them coffee. "I just like to give old things a new story." As the interview began, Liam made his grand entrance from the bedroom, dressed in overalls and being a very new, very shiny tool belt. He shot a quick, nervous glance at Audrey. "Oh, don't mind him," Audrey said to Clara, waving her hand dismissively. "That's just Liam. He's fixing a leak under my sink. It's been making a terrible gurgling noise for weeks. You know how old buildings are." Clara gave Liam a polite, uninterested smile before turning her attention back to Audrey. The photographer, however, seemed intrigued. Discreetly, he snapped a few photos of the handsome handyman in the background. The interview was going perfectly. Audrey was captivating, articulate, and passionate. She talked about her creative process, her love for vintage pieces, and her belief that a home should be a reflection of a person's soul. Liam, in the background, was putting on an Oscar-worthy performance. He knelt by the sink, staring into the pipes with a deeply serious expression, occasionally tapping one of his hands with a wrench in a way he hoped looked professional. Then came the question they both— "So, Audrey," Clara said, leaning forward with a knowing smile, "your star is clearly rising. Our readers would like to know, is there anyone special in your life? I couldn't help but notice the way your handyman was looking at you." Audrey's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm, exactly as they had rehearsed. She let out a soft, self-deprecating giggle. "Oh, Liam," she said, giving him a look of fond exasperation. "He's a work in progress." In the background, Liam pretended to be deeply focused on tightening a screw. He was already at his limit. "He's a great guy," Audrey continued, her voice layered with a carefully crafted tone of ambiguity. "Very dedicated to his work. We've been spending some time together. He's teaching me all about the importance of proper drainage." Clara laughed, clearly charmed by the pragmatic answer. "Well, he certainly is the most handsome plumber I've ever seen." "Isn't he?" Audrey said with a playful sigh. "It's a serious problem. Hard to focus on a dripping faucet when your plumber looks like that." The interview session ended shortly after. Clara and the photographer left, promising the feature would run in the following month's issue. As soon as the door closed, Audrey and Liam collapsed onto the sofa, amidst a fit of relieved laughter. "Legal plumbing," he said, pulling her into a hug. "You are a genius, an absolute wicked genius." "I told you I had it handled," she said, laughing against his chest. "You just needed to trust your culture." They remained like that for a long moment, embraced, the adrenaline of their joint performance giving way to a deep, comforting, "I love you, Audrey," he said, his voice deep and serious against her ear. "I love you too, you ridiculous fake plumber," she whispered back. He pulled back, his expression turning serious. "I'm going to tell you everything soon, I promise." "I know," she said, the smile fading slightly. "But just for tonight, can we just be us? The designer and the He smiled, a genuine, spontaneous smile that reached his eyes. "Deal." He kissed her, a long, slow kiss that celebrated their victory. They had faced the world together and won. But as they stood in the silence of her apartment, lost in their own perfect, fragile bubble, Neither of them knew that the photographer had snapped one last picture through the window. A picture of them kissing. A picture that, when captioned, "The new star of Brooklyn design and her mysterious man," was about to cause a citywide plumbing crisis of a very different kind. The next 2 weeks were the happiest of Audrey's life. She was living inside an original romantic comedy, complete with a charming, mysterious lead and a script full of witty dialogue. Liam, true to his word, made no attempt to shower her with gifts or impress her with his opulence. Instead, he courted her with small, perfect gestures. He would show up at Audrey's apartment after a long day with her favorite takeout and a silly. He listened to her for hours, talking about her design projects, offering insights that were always surprisingly intelligent and helpful. He was, for all intents and purposes, the perfect, and he also happened to be a complete fabrication. But for Audrey, who was in on the joke, this was part of the fun. The lie they shared was their own private world, a secret garden where they could be themselves, oblivious to his world's expectations and her world's cynicism. "You know," she said one evening, as they walked through Brooklyn Bridge Park, the shimmering Manhattan skyline stretching before them. "I'm starting to get worried." "About what?" he asked, pulling her close. "I'm actually starting to like this plumber," she said playfully. A smile played on his lips. "He's funny. He's a really good listener, and he's terrible at fixing things, which I find strangely endearing. I'm afraid that when the real Liam Vance shows up, I might be disappointed." He stopped walking and turned to her, a serious expression under the park. "There is no real Liam Vance without you, Audrey," he said, with a sincerity in his voice that deeply moved. "You're the only person who has ever truly seen me, the real me, even when I was lying." She smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile. "Well, the real you still owes me a new P-trap for my... The one you installed is dripping again." He laughed, the tension. "My plumbing skills are still a work in progress." The Downtown Living article was published on a Tuesday and was an instant hit. The journalist perfectly captured the essence of Audrey's spirit, her passion for design, and her unique voice. The photos were stunning, turning her small apartment into a chic, bohemian haven. Audrey's phone started buzzing with congratulations from friends, family, and former clients. Her freelance business exploded overnight. "I told you your talent was undeniable," Liam said, reading the article over her shoulder in her apartment, a proud smile on his face. "They called my restoration work a masterclass in modern nostalgia," she read, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I think that's the fanciest thing anyone has ever said about me." It was perfect, almost. On the third page of the feature, there was a small, candid photograph the photographer had snapped during an interview. It was Liam in the background, tool belt and all, looking at Audrey with an expression so open, a disarming adoration that was impossible to ignore. The caption read, "Right in her Brooklyn studio, with a little help from her mysterious and very handsome handyman, rumored to be her new boyfriend." "Oh my God," Audrey groaned, covering her face. "They put you in the paper." "And they called me handsome," Liam said, puffing out his chest. "I think I can live with that." "This is funny. What if someone recognizes you?" "Audrey, relax," he said, pulling her into a hug. "I'm a plumber in overalls covered in what looks like pipe grease. No one is going to recognize me." He was wrong. The article was a smash hit, and the photo of the mysterious handyman caused a small social media uproar. People were enchanted by the simplicity of the romance. Brooklyn designer and hot handyman became trending topics. Audrey was flooded with comments. "Forget the furniture. Tell us more about the plumber. This is the real-life rom-com we all need." For a few days, it was fun. Audrey and Liam laughed at the comments, enjoying their 15 minutes of anonymous internet fame. The fun ended on a Friday morning. Audrey was at her favorite coffee shop when her phone started vibrating with an unprecedented intensity. It was Chloe. "Audrey, did you see it?" Chloe's voice was a high-pitched shriek of panic. "See what?" Chloe, calm down. The high society. Mrs. Voss's blog. You need to look now. Audrey's blood ran cold. Mrs. Voss, the museum's gossip columnist. With trembling hands, Audrey opened her browser and navigated to the blog. The headline was plastered across the top of the page in giant, mocking letters. Magnate plumber Liam Vance fools Brooklyn's newest it girl in shocking social experiment. The article was brutal. It featured the downtown living photo side by side with a photo of Liam from the Met Gala. Voss, with her characteristic venom, had connected the dots. She recounted the fascinating story of the plumbing consultant she met at the museum, and then, with devastating precision, tore apart their entire story. She painted Liam as a bored, manipulative magnate playing with a working-class girl for his own amusement. And she painted Audrey as either an unwitting fool who was completely deceived or an ambitious social climber who orchestrated the whole thing. The comment section was a battlefield. Some defended Audrey, others attacked Liam, but most were just reveling in the scandal. Audrey's moment of professional triumph had been completely and utterly hijacked. She was no longer the new face of Brooklyn design. She was the magnate's plumber's fool. She sat in the coffee shop, the world spinning around her. Her phone was a relentless deluge of notifications, messages from friends, emails from clients, some curious, others canceling. The dream had turned into a nightmare. With a cold, numbing fury she hadn't felt in years, she stood up and left the coffee shop. She knew where she had to go. Liam was in his penthouse on a conference call about that German acquisition when Audrey burst in. She didn't knock. She simply flung the door open, her face a mask of paleness and treacherous fury. He looked at her once and knew the game was over. "Felix, I'll call you back," he said, ending the call without waiting for a response. He stood up slowly. "Audrey, don't," she said, her voice dangerously low. She held up her cell phone where Mrs. Voss's blog headline glowed on the screen. "Just don't." He felt the floor drop out from under him. "I saw it," he said, his own voice a hoarse whisper. "Audrey, I'm so sorry. I was about to call my lawyers. We can sue her." "Sue her." She let out a short, bitter, humorless laugh. "You think this is solved with money? You think a lawsuit is going to erase this?" She threw the phone onto his magnate sofa. "This is not a business problem, Liam. This is my life. My life turned into a public joke." "I never wanted this to happen," he said, taking a step toward her. "But it did," she retorted, taking a step back. "It happened because you couldn't just be honest. Not with me, not with... You had to have your game, your little... It wasn't a game, it was... It was what? Mechanism?" She cut him off, her voice rising with a sharper pain than anger. "You know, I actually felt sorry for you. The poor rich boy who was so afraid of being loved because of his money. But you know what's worse than being loved for your money, Liam? Being used by someone who is afraid of his own life." The accusation hit him like a physical. "I never used you. Didn't you? Used my world as your little hideout. You used my life as your fantasy. And now that the costume party is over, I'm the one left covered in glitter and shame. You just go back to your..." She pointed with a trembling finger at the panoramic window overlooking. "My big break, Liam. The thing I worked my whole life for. That article was supposed to be about my talent, and now it's about you. It's all about the magnate and his fool plumber date. You didn't just lie to me, you stole my story and turned it into something about you." He was speechless because he knew she was right. His lie, his fear, his world, it had all crashed down on her and buried. "Audrey, please," he pleaded, his voice choked. "Let me fix this. I'll do..." "You can't fix this," she said, her voice now a hollow, broken. She wiped the tears with the back of her hand, a gesture of defeat so profound it broke his. "I need to go. I can't be your plumber anymore. And I don't think I can be anything else." She turned and walked to the door, her steps heavy. "Audrey, don't!" he begged, his voice rough with a desperation he had never known. "Don't leave me!" She stopped at the door, her back to him. "I'm not walking away from you, Liam," she said, her voice barely. "I'm walking away from whatever this is, this lie, this game, because it stopped being fun a long time ago." And with that, she was gone. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing through the vast, silent pen. Liam Vance was alone in the middle of his glass domain, surrounded by all the world's opulence and power. And for the first time in his life, he was complete. For 3 days, Liam Vance's penthouse felt less like a home than a mausoleum. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the city that belonged to him, but he no longer felt parting. He had canceled all his meetings. He hadn't spoken to his family. He just sat in the vast, empty living room, the echo of Audrey's last words repeating incessantly in his mind. "I can't be your plumber anymore, and I don't think I can be anything else." He had built an empire on the principle of control, of always being 10 steps ahead. But he had played one game too many, and in trying to protect his heart, he had lost it completely. "Sir," Felix appeared at his side, holding a tablet with a worried expression. "Your father has called 7 times, and Mrs. Voss's article has been picked up by the Associated Press. It's national." Liam didn't even move. He simply looked out the window at the millions of lights that represented millions of lives with which he could not connect. He had everything, and he had... "Felix," he said, his voice hoarse. "Get me an interview. Live with Sarah..." Felix blinked. Sarah Jenkins was the toughest, most respected journalist on television. She was known for taking down politicians and CEOs with a "Sir, are you Our public relations team strongly advises against it." "I'm not asking for public relations advice," Liam said, finally turning to face his assistant. There was a fire in his eyes that had been absent for days. "I'm not going to hide anymore. I caused this mess in public. I'm going to fix it." He stood up, a new and terrifying determination etched on his face. "Get me the interview. And Felix, no talking points. Just a camera, a chair, and..." 2 nights later, Liam was sitting across from Sarah Jenkins. The bright studio lights felt like an interrogation lab. Millions of people were watching. He knew Audrey was probably watching too. That was the only audience that... "Mr. Vance," Sarah began, her voice smooth and professional, "the last few days have been a whirlwind of speculation. One article described you as a manipulative magnate and the young designer Audrey Carter as your unwilling victim. What do you have to say about that?" Liam took a deep breath. Ignoring the teleprompter his PR team had desperately tried to program, he looked directly into the camera. "I say the article is wrong," he said, his voice clear and firm. "Audrey Carter is not a victim. She was never a victim. I was." Sarah Jenkins raised a perfectly sculpted eye. "You were the..." "Yes," Liam said. "I was a victim of my own... For years, I've lived in a world where my last name walks into the room before I do, where people see a walking bank account. I grew so cynical, so terrified of the idea of being used because of my money, that I built a fortress around myself and started conducting these ridiculous experiments, pretending to be someone else to see if I could find a single genuine..." He leaned forward, his voice loaded with a raw, painful honesty. "It was a cowardly act, selfish and deeply unfair, and I am truly sorry for it." He paused, and then looked directly into the camera again, as if speaking straight. "But then I met her, and she was everything my world was not. She was funny and authentic, and she had an incredibly She called me out on my terrible lies. She saw through my clumsy charade right away. She even made a guide for me on how not to look poor and famous." The studio crew fell completely silent, mesmerized. "The greatest irony," he continued, his voice slightly choked, "is that in my arrogant attempt to see if she was real, I was the one who was faking it. The lie wasn't about the plumbing. The lie was me thinking I needed to hide to be seen. Audrey Carter saw me from the very first minute, Not the plumber, not the magnate, just me. And I was too afraid to see her back. He took a deep breath. His public redemption was next. The article called her a fool. On top, it read, Partnership Agreement for Life. Between Liam Vance, the extravagant magnate, and Audrey Carter, the brilliant designer and part-time detective. Her eyes scanned the clauses, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face as she... First, the ridiculous magnate hereby agrees to uphold a lifetime of honesty, with no more secret identities or falsifications of occupation or plumbing-related lies, unless for mutually agreed-upon humor. Second, the brilliant designer agrees to provide ongoing consultation on how to be a normal human being, including but not limited to the proper use of coupons, the art of cooking pasta that does not turn into a solid brick, and how to navigate the complex. 3. Both parties agree to the merger, not of companies, but of lives, to build something real, something honest, and something replete with an absurd amount of love and... 4. This contract is binding, eternal, and comes with one final, non-negotiable. Audrey looked up from the paper, her eyes shining with tears. He was kneeling before her, extending not a ring, but a simple, perfect silver pipe wrench. Audrey Carter, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Will you agree to be my permanent plumbing consultant for the rest of my life? She laughed and cried at the same time. You are the most absurd man I have ever met, she said, pulling him to. Is that a yes? He asked, his heart in his... That's a contractual yes, she said, and kissed him, sealing their new, very real... A year later, the living room of their new home, a beautiful restored Brooklyn brownstone that Audrey had designed from top to bottom, was filled with the joyful chaos of a housewarming party. Chloe was arguing with Felix about the stock market. Mrs. Voss was there, now a surprisingly loyal friend, touring Audrey's latest furniture restoration. Liam walked in from the kitchen carrying a tray of champagne. He stopped and just watched his wife as she laughed with her friends, her face illuminated by a joy that filled every corner of the room. Their house was no longer silent. Hey, he said, walking up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. Happy? More than happy, she said, leaning back against him. Her design firm, which she had launched with a small, interest-free loan from an anonymous investor, had just been featured in architectural You know, she said, a mischievous glint in her. The guest bathroom sink was making a funny gurgling noise. He smiled, kissing the top of her head. Don't worry, he said, his voice low and cheerful. I'll call. What do you think of Liam and Audrey's story? On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate their relationship? Tell us your opinion. Leave your... And for everyone who stayed with us until the end, who believes that true love is worth all the necessary lies and laughter to find it, please comment happily ever after. We are very grateful to share these stories with you. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will change the world.